Foreign Minister Schallenberg, thank you very much for the time you're giving me.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's start with the story that's dominating the headlines, please, the issue between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. Firstly, Austria has just withdrawn its funding, like many other Western countries, for the UN Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA, at a time when it's been providing humanitarian relief for all the displaced and seriously desperate Palestinians in Gaza. The reason given is that Israel provided documentation that there were 12 UNRWA representatives that were involved in the attacks of the 7th of October last year. But when you think about it on the scale of things, UNRWA has 30,000 employees. So isn't this reaction by a lot of the Western countries a bit excessive, especially at a time when the Palestinians so desperately need that help from the relief agency?
Well, I agree with you that we have to help and we have to do more to ease the human suffering in Gaza. But it is deeply distressing if an organization such as the UN, and we Austrians have a very special relationship because we have here in Vienna one of the seats, one of the headquarters of the United Nations. And this is an organization which has to be beyond any doubt. And if there are very serious allegations that members of UNRWA were part of the horrendous attacks of 7th of October, then the least we have to do is to ask for immediate and full investigations. And I believe what we had yesterday in New York, briefing with UN Secretary General, and it has been encouraging because I have the feeling they acknowledged the problem. They promised an external and an internal investigation. And just to specify, we didn't withdraw money. We just suspended payments for the time being in awaiting the results of the investigation. And I believe it has to be taken very seriously because the UN, again, has to be impartial. Perception is very important, especially in the Middle East. And the UN has to be beyond any reproach because we want it to be part of the solution in the long term. And actually, we're all looking for this political perspective, which we need urgently.
Well, the thing is, Minister, yeah, it's totally understood that there is need for an investigation with such allegations. The only issue is that the situation in Gaza is particularly unique with the extent to which the people have been displaced, the amount of injuries, the amount of deaths. So this kind of suspension of funds, and not just from Austria, but other Western countries, is really at a critical time.
I agree. And the problem is that we have these serious allegations, but we have to see also that UNRWA is not the only organization. Austria, for instance, that's an important information because I have the feeling there's sometimes fake news going around. We didn't stop our development aid or humanitarian aid. We actually increased it. We offered 30 million euros further for the humanitarian relief and the humanitarian aid, which is urgently necessary. And we're working together with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, the World Food Programme, and others. So it is not that UNRWA is the only organization which is present, but my hope is that we can very clearly, with the help of the UN, establish clear benchmarks, a clear investigation, establish measures which the UN has to take, and then we can again restart funding the important work of UNRWA.
Sir, on a broader scale, there are many human rights critics discuss what seems to be very unusual censorship amongst European countries when it comes to certain use of certain expressions such as ceasefire or banning of all marches in support of the Palestinian people. This seems very much in contrast with the idea of democracies in Europe. What happened to free speech?
Well, you have to make a difference. We had manifestations here in Austria with the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine has to be free. And sorry, there's a country between the river and the sea, and there are people living there, Israelis. This is a call for genocide at the end of the day. So this is not a neutral demonstration for a peace process, for a two-state solution, anything, because all of that you can do. But from the river to the sea is not a slogan which we want to hear on the streets in Vienna, Salzburg, or elsewhere in Austria.
Understood. Actually, it's interesting. I was reading that for many young Palestinians, it doesn't represent the same thing. For them, it's the idea that they would be free as people to have their self-determination. But I understand the roots of it, and I can understand.
We want that. We want that. And I always say and repeat myself, there are the two-state solution and normalization are the only game in town. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians will somehow vanish in thin air. We have to find urgently a political process which can lead to Palestinians and Israelis living in security and peace side by side. That's called a two-state solution. So I agree with this call for representation for non-state, but it is perceived very differently by others. And I believe in this very emotional moment, everybody should check his own language.
So actually, yes, it's the official reason given by many governments is that there is fear that it would increase the amount of anti-Semitism in their countries and lead to a rise in anti-Semitic attacks. But is there not a fundamental problem now with the conversion of what is a land dispute, which is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, making the conflict appear to be one against Jewish people in general, where perhaps the majority of people are protesting really for, human rights as opposed to simply stating something that is anti-Jewish?
I believe we shouldn't overcharge the conflict, and I agree with you of being a religious conflict. It is at the end the question since 1948 of how people can live side by side in peace together. And we were close at several occasions in the last decades to a possible deal, but each time we didn't quite achieve it. And the lesson, I believe, and hopefully looking back in a couple of years, that we learned the lesson of the 7th of October, that we made a big mistake, wrong assumption the last couple of years, that the process of normalization, the so-called Abraham Accords, could replace to a certain degree the Palestinian issue or somehow lead to it one way or another. We now know we have to do both at the same time. We have to continue with the normalization. And I've heard from leaders in Arab states, it's on life support, but not dead yet. And this is encouraging. And we have urgently to develop a political process leading to a two-state solution.
I understand the sensitivities, especially in parts of Europe, when it comes to the situation with Israel. But many people ask, why is it that European politicians seem so scared to fall foul of Israel when it's a country that has so many UN resolutions against it with regards to the way the Palestinians are treated?
But that is not the issue. I mean, we Austrians have for decades now a very strong and friendly relationship with Arab countries, and many of them, the foreign ministers, are personal friends of mine. And we have a very special strategic partnership with Israel. So the one thing doesn't exclude the other. What we want to see in the Middle East has immediate repercussions on our own security and stability in Europe. We feel it here in the streets. There's a high degree of emotionality. I would like to see a high degree of rationality returning, not only to the Middle East, but to world affairs in general. And so this is a wrong assumption. It is simply that the Middle East, for us Europeans, is immediate neighborhood. And what happens there matters to us and matters to our security.
It's interesting. Austria, of course, is very proud of its neutrality since the 1955 Permanent Neutrality Treaty. But interestingly, in contrast, the situation with Russia and Ukraine seems to be a bit different in that Austria has very strongly supported the Ukrainians in contrast, to the situation with Palestinians in condemning the Russian aggression and violation of international laws as it sees it. So I wonder, when you have that kind of contrast, how the world will judge.
Well, thank you for this question, because I believe it's very important to make a difference. Number one, Russia simply invaded a sovereign state, believing that is in its neo-imperialistic impulse that this country has no right to exist. And this is something we haven't seen in Europe since the Second World War. And it is distressing to many Europeans to have war back in our continent. And for us, a smaller country, we have no nuclear weapons. We depend on an international system where rules are applied, where international law is respected. We're not a country with nukes. A permanent member of the Security Council can decide to do whatever they want to. On the other side, the issue we have now in Gaza, we have to make the difference. That's very important. We make the difference between PLO, Fatah, the Palestinian people, and Hamas. Hamas are not the Palestinians. Hamas, in our eyes, is a terrorist organization. It denies the right of existence of Israel. It has excluded itself from any political perspective and process. And it has committed a massacre on the 7th of October, something that in my eyes, when I talk to my colleagues and friends in the Ramallah, is something that is extremely distressing for them too. So we have to make this difference. This is a terrorist attack. What happened on the 7th of October, and I very vividly remember when our services here in Vienna called me and asked me, Minister, how good are your nerves? And I unluckily said they're good. And then I got videos and photographs sent to me, which I haven't seen since ISIL in Daesh. This is pure terror. This is a massacre. There's nothing to do with a war as we see it in Ukraine, where sovereign countries simply invades another.
So there's no doubting the horror of the attacks that took place, the extreme level of the attacks that took place on the 7th of October against Israel. But a lot of the Palestinians are saying their condition has been ongoing for a long, long time. We're talking 7 decades, and certainly in the last few decades, extreme. If you are calling for respect of international law, then surely the resolutions by the UN are something that should also be implemented heavily.
I fully agree with you. And we Austrians have been again and again very loud and clear on this point. As I say, for instance, now that settler violence is simply unacceptable. Provocation at the holy sites, unacceptable. And we have always criticized settlement, the policy of conducting settlements in the West Bank. All of this leads to further, inciting violence, and we have to break out of this circle. And I believe even that it is a huge lack of solidarity towards the Israeli people if radical settlers commit acts of violence in the West Bank. So I'm very clear on that. And yes, you're right. International law is blind. It has to be applied by Israel. It has to be applied by the Palestinians and by Russians, by everybody on this planet. We Austrians are not excluded either.
So what concerns do you have, something closer to home, what concerns do you have about Austria's dependence on Russian gas imports? They're down a bit, about 66% last summer on previous amounts stated around 79%. But you've had criticism within Austria itself that this dependence on Russia and this continued paying for such a large amount of import of Russian gas, it's been described as paying blood money to Russia. How do you react to those criticisms?
Well, I don't believe that is the right way of putting it. We have, as a government, made very clear that we want to become independent of Russian gas, and for the latest by 2027. We have decreased it from our dependency from 80% of our gas imports to 50%, but we are a landlocked country in the center of the European continent. Luckily, we are capable of producing ourselves 80% of our electricity with renewable means, but we cannot simply build LNG terminals. We are dependent. And now we've seen the debate between the United States and Germany. It's not easy for any European country to quickly change the sources without endangering your own jobs and industry. So this is an ongoing process, but our aim is very clear. We want to take away this leverage, you could say, from Russia, this possibility to exert pressure or blackmail even other parties, because that is what we've seen the last couple of 2 years, and we don't want to be dependent on anybody to that degree in the future.
So as I wrap up the interview, I have to ask you, you yourself have warned of the risk of nuclear conflict, stating that there's a lot of pressure on the anti-nuclear regime to try to create some kind of break in the impasse that seems to have built up. Do you really feel the situation is, as you've described it, a seemingly hopeless predicament?
Well, I remember last year, you're absolutely right. We are criticized from time to time for being, daydreamers of pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons. But I remember when Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, uttered a couple of sentences about the state of alarm in the nuclear forces in Russia, and suddenly everybody became extremely nervous and upset. And nuclear weapons are still the biggest threat for humankind. And what we managed to do with cluster ammunition, what we managed to do with anti-personnel mines, I believe we can do and we should do on nuclear weapons as well. And it's not limited to nuclear weapons. This year, for instance, here in Austria, we're organizing a big conference together with the United Nations on lethal autonomous weapon system, killer robots, you might say, terminators. This is again something where I believe we have to push harder, work harder to make our world a safer place, and you can count on Austria being at the vanguard of these efforts.
As a final thought, Minister, as a senior foreign minister of a notable country dealing with international affairs, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the way the world situation seems to be developing over the last few years?
My biggest fear is actually we humans have a limited attention span. And a lot of attention has been taken by the atrocious war of attrition, which we see in Russia. We are again living through a winter of war in Ukraine. Now, all the emotions and the horrors we see and have seen in the Middle East. My biggest fear is that there might be the one or the other world leader who thinks, since the limelight is now on this part of the scene, that he can, in his region, settle some scores. And that is actually the biggest source of insecurity we have. We have the Southern Caucasus, we have the Sahel, with an effect of dominoes, with coup d'etat. We have Western and Eastern Africa. So we have many places on the planet where crisis moments could erupt at any moment. And we have to be extremely attentive, not to give the impression that we are fully absorbed only the one crisis and that we neglect other places on this planet.
Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg, thank you for your time. I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the invitation.